They signed him away like he was nothing. Quiet, temporary, replaceable. 48 hours later, his name surfaced in places it was never supposed to appear. Tied to billions, sealed structures, and a system that had been waiting for his divorce to activate everything. But the real shock wasn't what he became. It was realizing the marriage ended just one day before the truth made him completely unreachable. 812 Travis County Courthouse. The hallway lights had a dull institutional hum, the kind that never fully switches off even when everything else feels still. I sat on a metal bench that carried the temperature of the building itself. Cold, indifferent, permanent. People moved past me in short, controlled bursts. Lawyers with stacked folders. Assistants checking phones without stopping. Every step sounded like it belonged to a system that had already decided the outcome before anyone entered the room. I noticed how no one looked at anyone for longer than a second. Not because of urgency, but because recognition would make it personal. And nothing here was supposed to be personal. 817. I adjusted my jacket and felt the weight in my inner pocket. My father's ring pressed against my ribs through the fabric. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to. I already knew its shape by memory, down to the uneven engraving that no one else would ever notice. Across from me, Olivia Hart sat perfectly still. Not waiting. Positioning. There was a difference and she knew it. Her posture didn't change when the attorney placed the document between us. Only her eyes tracked the motion, like she was confirming timing rather than content. The prenup lay on the table like something already finalized, even before my name touched it. Every page had been built to define absence. No shared assets. No future claims. No ambiguity left for interpretation. My existence inside it had been reduced to a fixed zero, written with legal precision that didn't require emotion to function. I read none of it aloud. I didn't need to. I was watching the structure instead of the words. Contracts like this were never about fairness. They were about assumptions, and assumptions always revealed more than language. 821. The attorney shifted slightly, just enough to signal impatience without breaking professionalism. He had done this before. I could tell from the way he avoided eye contact at the exact moment anything meaningful might be inferred. Olivia didn't look at me. Not once. That absence was not accidental. It was protective in a way she probably didn't even name internally. If she didn't acknowledge me fully, she didn't have to acknowledge uncertainty. I placed my hand over the signature line and paused. Not hesitation. Measurement. The kind of pause that happens when a system expects compliance but doesn't understand timing. For a fraction of a second, I felt the ring again, harder this time, as if it had shifted inside my pocket. A reminder of something older than this room, older than this agreement, older than the assumption that I had nothing to lose. 824. I signed. The pen moved smoothly, almost too smoothly, like it had been prepared for this exact motion. The ink dried immediately. No correction, no resistance, just completion. The attorney collected the document without looking at me. Papers always leave faster than they arrive. That was something I had learned early. Anything important tends to exit quietly once it has extracted what it needs. Olivia finally exhaled, barely visible, as if she had been holding a calculation rather than a breath. Still no glance in my direction. The relief wasn't emotional. It was procedural. A checkpoint passed. I stood up before anyone else moved. Chairs didn't scrape. Conversations didn't start. The room didn't acknowledge transition. It only recorded completion. 827. I walked out into the corridor alone. The air outside the room was slightly warmer, but that didn't matter. Temperature was not the point of places like this. Control was. I could feel the document behind me being filed, scanned, archived into systems that would never question its logic. My name had been processed into a category it didn't fully understand yet. There was no anger in me, no reaction that would register externally. Only structure, sequence, a timeline already set in motion long before I entered the building. As I reached the end of the hallway, I slowed once. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed to confirm something internally that no one else in that building could see. The prenup had just been finalized, and none of them had accounted for the condition that wasn't on paper, wasn't visible in assets, and wasn't part of any disclosure requirement. That was the only detail I carried with me as I left the courthouse behind. 9-3 Austin River District. The glass tower reflected the river in fragmented lines, like the city had been split and reassembled incorrectly. I stood at the kitchen counter without using it. Nothing was out of place, which meant everything was under control or carefully designed to look like it was. Olivia moved through the apartment on a schedule I could predict without looking up. 9:10 coffee. 9:22 phone calls. 9:40 emails that changed tone depending on who was speaking. Her life was acceleration disguised as stability. I didn't match it. I didn't try. I repeated the same routines I had kept for years. Same routes, same timing, same absence of visible progress. In this environment, stillness registered as failure. 9:18. The first envelope arrived that morning. White, unmarked except for the legal header. Not delivered to the main mailbox. Hand-routed through a secondary channel I had set up months earlier. I didn't open it immediately. I placed it inside a black folder already half full. The language on the visible corner still said enough. Trust confirmation. Interim valuation. Restricted asset phase. No one in Olivia's world used words like restricted phase unless something was being prepared for removal or transfer. She noticed it later that day. Not the content, the existence. Her eyes caught the edge of the folder when I left it on the counter for less than a minute. The reaction was minimal, but it stayed longer than it should have. After that, she adjusted her distance from me by a few centimeters whenever we passed each other. Subtle enough to be dismissed. Precise enough to be intentional. Her environment started reflecting the same pattern. Friends and family spoke around me, not to me. Conversations about growth, investment, trajectory. Words that implied movement I was not demonstrating. No one said it directly at first. They didn't need to. The absence of visible acceleration was already an accusation. 10:2. I sat by the window and observed the river traffic. Cargo barges moved slowly, but they moved with purpose. Stillness was not the same as inactivity. That was something most people failed to distinguish. Another envelope arrived 2 days later. Then another. The intervals were shrinking. Each one carried less explanation and more structure. Dates, conditions, verifications. The system behind it was changing behavior, not waiting anymore, counting. I tracked it without marking it in any visible way. No notes, no digital logs. Only memory. That was safer. Olivia found the second envelope herself. 11:47 kitchen counter. She turned it once in her hand before placing it down. Her attention stayed on it longer than necessary, then shifted to me, then away again, as if confirming something she wasn't ready to define. That evening her tone in conversations with others shifted. Slightly sharper. Slightly more precise. As if she was correcting a variable that had begun to drift. I continued to remain unchanged. That was the part I could not afford to modify. Any visible improvement, any acceleration, would create a traceable deviation. The trust required invisibility. Not poverty, not failure. Invisibility. And invisibility had started to feel less like protection and more like containment. 12:30. A message arrived through a secure line I rarely checked. Not a notification. A trigger. The formatting had changed. That meant protocol shift. I didn't open it immediately either. I already knew what it meant without reading. Systems don't alter structure unless timing becomes critical. When I finally did, the language was shorter than before. Fewer conditions. Reduced ambiguity. The countdown had tightened. Something that had been stable for years had entered its final phase without announcement. Olivia passed behind me as I read it. She didn't stop. But her pace slowed by a fraction, as if the air had become denser without explanation. That was the moment I understood the shift was no longer confined to documents. It was beginning to leak into perception. By 13:00, I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where it had been before. Alignment mattered. Details mattered. Nothing could suggest urgency. Outside, the river continued moving at the same speed. Inside, the timeline no longer matched it. And for the first time since the courthouse, I confirmed what I had been waiting for. The system that had kept me invisible for years was no longer just maintaining distance. It was preparing to collapse it. 8:41, Austin, early fall. The Hart's house sat on elevated ground, with wide glass panels that made every room visible from multiple angles. I noticed early that visibility here was not accidental. It was a form of control disguised as openness. I arrived exactly on time. 8:40. Never early enough to signal eagerness, never late enough to be questioned. The entry routine was always the same. Shoes aligned, coat placed, brief scan of faces already gathered in the living room. No one greeted me directly anymore. I had become part of the background architecture of these meetings. Olivia was already inside the conversation flow. She didn't shift when I entered. Her attention stayed on the group, on the decisions being shaped without resistance. That was new. She used to anchor herself slightly toward me. That alignment had disappeared without announcement. 8:52. The discussion moved to her trajectory. Career plans. Investment direction. Long-term positioning. Every phrase framed her as someone in motion. I was mentioned only in passing. Not as part of her future structure, but as a temporary variable that had already served its function. No one said it with hostility. That was not necessary. The tone was administrative, almost neutral. That made it more stable. I observed without participating. The role I had adopted in these rooms required consistency. Any visible correction would break the pattern I had maintained for years. 9:7. Olivia shifted slightly in her chair when someone referenced alignment with suitable partners. The phrase wasn't aimed at me directly, but it didn't need to be. The implication filled the space automatically. I noted the timing. She did not look at me, not even briefly. That absence had weight. It was no longer passive. It was structured. Her father spoke next about opportunity windows, about timing in markets, relationships, positioning. Everything reduced to timing and leverage. Human connections reframed as strategic exposure. I understood the language. I had been trained in it long before I ever entered this house. The difference was that they used it without knowing what it cost to live inside it. 9:23. My phone vibrated once. No sound. I checked without moving noticeably. Another trust update. Shorter than before. More compressed language. A single reference to final readiness phase. No explanation attached. None was needed anymore. That meant the system was no longer observing progress. It was observing stability under pressure. I closed the screen immediately. No reaction. No change in posture. Visibility was always the risk factor. Across the room, Olivia laughed at something said by one of her colleagues. The sound was natural, but I registered the timing more than the content. It aligned with a shift in how she was being positioned in the group. She was being separated from me socially without confrontation. A slow extraction process. Quiet and systematic. 9:41. The conversation around me began to narrow toward comparisons. Who was progressing? Who was not? Who was keeping up? The language never used names directly at first, but it always circled back. I remained still. Stillness was the only acceptable form of invisibility. Then I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Olivia no longer corrected assumptions about me, not even small ones. Previously, she would adjust perception in subtle ways. Now she let them settle. That was the first structural change I could not ignore. 10:2. The meeting ended in stages, like most of theirs did. People drifted rather than departed. Conversations fractured into smaller units. I remained near the edge of the room until the density of attention dropped below threshold. Olivia moved first toward the hallway, not toward me. That deviation was precise. Intentional or not, it functioned the same. I followed at distance, not physically close enough to suggest dependency, not far enough to signal separation. The balance had always been mathematical. In the hallway mirror, I saw us in sequence rather than unity. That image stayed longer than expected. 10:17. Outside, the air was warmer than inside the house, but it felt less controlled. Exposure replaced structure. Olivia paused near the driveway, not waiting, recalibrating. That was when I registered the second shift. Her conversations were no longer about shared direction. They were about individual expansion. She had begun describing futures without default inclusion, not excluding me verbally, simply not referencing me at all. That form of absence was more decisive than rejection. I did not interrupt it. Interruption would have created resistance, and resistance would have drawn attention. Instead, I continued observing as the pattern completed itself in real time. And then, in the silence between movements, I understood the full direction of her recalibration. She was no longer deciding how we moved forward together. She was testing how far she could move without me. Late autumn, Austin. The air had shifted in a way that made every sound feel closer than it should have been. The apartment no longer felt like a shared structure. It felt like two parallel systems occupying the same space without interaction. The change started with something small. A single sentence during a routine evening. Not sharp, not emotional, just precise enough to reclassify everything that came before it. Olivia said she felt like she was the only one generating movement in the relationship. Nothing broke immediately. That was the deceptive part. Systems don't collapse on impact. They adjust first. After that night, timing inside the apartment changed. She started leaving earlier without coordination, returning later without explanation. The rhythm that had once been implicit dissolved into individual schedules. I did not adjust mine. That became the friction point. My consistency, which had always been neutral, started being interpreted differently. Not as stability. As resistance. A fixed object in a system that required velocity. I observed the shift without reacting to it. Reaction creates trace. Trace creates exposure. 2 days later, I received confirmation from the trust structure. Final activation conditions had been met. The next phase was no longer theoretical. It was procedural. But the final clause remained unchanged. Any visible financial linkage, any external indicator of asset control, would delay full release. The system required separation from perception before granting access. It was not negotiable. It was structural. Olivia began reorganizing her language around the future, not abruptly. Gradually enough that it looked like clarity rather than departure. Plans that once included 2 inputs started being framed with 1. At first, it was logistical. Later, it became structural. Eventually, it stopped referencing shared outcome entirely. I tracked the progression without interrupting it. Each omission was more informative than explanation. The word "we" disappeared first from planning, then from assumptions, then from casual reference. That sequence mattered more than the decision itself. I noted timestamps internally, not for memory, for pattern verification. Her distance was not emotional at first. It was operational. She was removing dependencies before removing presence. The system of our life together was being decomposed in reverse order of how it had been built. I remained unchanged. That was the only variable I was not allowed to modify. One evening, she reviewed something on her phone for a long time without speaking. I could see the calculation behind the stillness. Not hesitation, resolution forming in layers. Nothing about it was sudden. That was important. Sudden changes can be questioned. Gradual ones cannot. The idea of separation had already moved past emotional justification. It had entered procedural logic. I recognized the structure immediately. It mirrored the way contracts are unwound when they are no longer serving their original assumption. She was not reacting to me anymore. She was finalizing interpretation. When the conversation about ending the marriage finally occurred, it did not feel like initiation. It felt like confirmation of a decision already executed internally. There was no escalation. No rupture. Only alignment between spoken conclusion and internal system. I did not resist it. Resistance would have introduced variables I could not afford. The trust condition still remained active in the background, counting down in silence. The documents were prepared quickly. The process was efficient in a way that suggested prior rehearsal. Nothing unnecessary was added. Nothing emotional was preserved in language. Signatures were collected, dates recorded. Structures dissolved on paper without visible friction. I observed every step without deviation. Not because it was easy, but because deviation would have invalidated everything that had been built underneath it. The final page was signed in the same environment as the first had been years earlier. But the meaning had inverted completely. There was no ceremony attached to closure, only completion. The next morning, the system updated. Not with noise, not with notification, with status change. I registered the shift internally before I saw it formally confirmed. Independent ownership achieved. The timing of it created a discrepancy that did not resolve immediately. The moment legal separation finalized, the restriction that had defined my entire existence lifted without delay. What had required invisibility to protect was now fully active. And the contradiction was immediate. The condition that had forced separation was the same condition that triggered full access. The system had not been delayed by failure. It had been waiting for absence. 48 hours after the divorce, the system stopped being private. I first noticed it at 6:17. My phone lit up without vibration. Not a notification pattern I had configured. Something external had triggered visibility protocols I no longer controlled. By 6:23, my name was circulating in financial feeds, not as speculation, as confirmation, structured reports, verified holdings. Linked disclosures that had been dormant for years suddenly surfaced at once. Hailed Caldwell Trust. Full activation. Estimated valuation expanding in real time as assets were reclassified across jurisdictions. I watched it unfold without touching the screen again. The data was already propagating faster than any manual response could contain. The apartment felt unchanged. That contrast mattered. Outside systems were shifting. Inside space remained static. That mismatch always created delayed consequences. 7:2. The first wave of recognition reached outside my direct visibility. Reports referenced inheritance structures that had been intentionally suppressed under legal condition. My name appeared in contexts that assumed public existence had always been active. It hadn't. It had been withheld. Olivia did not contact me. Not immediately. I could reconstruct her timeline without seeing it. The delay between publication and awareness was predictable. She would not have been looking for me. She believed the structure had already closed. That assumption broke first. The information did not arrive as news in isolation. It arrived as contradiction. Everything she had categorized about me required reinterpretation at once. Not my behavior. Not my silence. The sequence itself. The order of events mattered more than the events. 8:11. I moved through the apartment while screens continued updating behind me. Price adjustments. Asset confirmations. Institutional reactions. None of it required input. The system had already completed its transition. I noted something subtle. The speed of external recognition exceeded the speed of personal correction. People were learning who I was faster than they could revise what they had believed. That imbalance created instability in perception layers around me. Her family reacted first, not directly to me. Through channels that assumed continuity still existed. Messages routed through intermediaries, firms, advisors. All of them treated access as if it could still be negotiated. It couldn't. The structure that defined my visibility had already been replaced by a different tier of access. One that did not interface through personal contact points. I had become reachable only through systems they did not control. 9:3. The first attempt to contact me through conventional channels failed silently. No rejection. No response. Just absence of routing acknowledgement. That absence was not technical error. It was structural exclusion. The shift became visible externally when media cycles stabilized around the same conclusion. Identification complete. Ownership confirmed. Structure active. At that point, perception stabilized around a single narrative. Discovery of hidden wealth. That interpretation was incomplete, but functional enough for public consumption. What none of them accounted for was timing. The sequence of separation relative to activation. That gap was where the real imbalance existed. By evening, I had confirmation that I was now fully integrated into operational oversight layers. Access granted. Restrictions removed. Visibility normalized at institutional level. It should have felt like expansion. It did not. It felt like separation that had completed a fraction too late. The final realization did not come from the data itself. It came from the absence of any channel through which that realization could now reach the person who mattered most in the previous version of this structure. Olivia had already acted under one set of assumptions. And those assumptions had collapsed exactly one day before they became irreversible. 9:14. Outskirts of Austin. The construction site looked quieter than it was. Noise had been absorbed into structure rather than released into air. Steel frames rising in controlled intervals. Concrete zones marked but not yet filled. Everything in progress, nothing complete. I arrived without escort. Without announcement. That mattered less now than it used to. Presence no longer needed validation. It only needed recognition, and even that was optional. Workers registered me briefly. Then returned to their tasks. No curiosity. No adjustment in behavior. That absence of reaction was itself a signal. The system had already normalized me at this level. I walked the perimeter once before stopping near the central structure. The foundation lines were clean. Execution was aligned with projection. No visible deviation. Then I noticed her. Olivia stood near the outer fence, not inside the site, not part of it. Observing at distance that suggested she had arrived without intention of being seen. 9:22. The moment did not escalate. It settled, like pressure finding equilibrium instead of release. She had changed in ways that were visible only through comparison, not appearance. Positioning. The way she held stillness now suggested recalibration rather than confidence. I did not move toward her immediately. I measured distance first. Not emotional distance. Physical, structural. The space between fence and site was not neutral. It marked separation between observer and builder. She spoke first without sound being necessary. Her mouth moved, but I tracked behavior rather than language. The pattern was consistent. Explanation. Correction. Attempted reconstruction of narrative. She tried to reframe past decisions. She tried to reclassify earlier assumptions as incomplete data. The structure of her argument depended on missing information at the time of judgment. I already knew that pattern. It was the most common response when systems failed to account for unseen variables. I listened without interruption. Not acceptance. Not rejection. Observation. Her gestures increased slightly in frequency as she continued. Small corrections in stance. Micro adjustments in balance. Indicators of internal instability masked as explanation. The core message remained constant. She had evaluated based on what she had access to. If access had been different, outcome would have changed. That was the assumption she could not move beyond. I looked past her toward the structure behind. The project was still advancing. Reinforcement cycles continuing without pause. Progress independent of narrative. That contrast mattered more than anything she was saying, because it showed the difference between perception and system reality. She was still operating inside perception. I had already moved past it. A gap formed in the conversation without any verbal shift. Not silence. Disconnection. Two processes running without shared protocol. I registered something precise at that moment. She was not trying to return to me as a person. She was trying to restore alignment with an outcome that no longer existed. The distinction mattered. I did not correct her. Correction implied shared framework. That framework was no longer active between us. 9:37. I turned slightly toward the construction site again. That movement ended the exchange without closure. No confirmation. No rejection. Just termination of shared focus. Behind me, her presence remained, but it no longer integrated into the system I was observing. I walked forward. The site absorbed me immediately. Sound returned in fragments. Metal contact. Equipment cycles. Structured activity without narrative weight. I moved through it without interruption. No one stopped me. No one needed to. Olivia did not follow past the boundary. That line remained intact. Later, I stood alone inside the partially completed structure. Elevated platform. Unfinished edges. City visible in segmented lines through exposed framing. There was no sense of victory. No emotional completion. That would have implied conflict resolution. There was only alignment. Everything had reached its correct position based on the sequence that had already occurred. The realization settled in quietly. The outcome was never about concealment or exposure. It was about timing. And timing had already decided everything before either of us understood what was being measured.